I'm looking forward to opening God's Word to Luke 5, starting in verse 33. Hope you are too. I think your interest in watching part or all this is an indication of that. So have the Bible open. Take time. You can rewind if it's not live, which is kind of an advantage too. Hope maybe something along the way is said to make you want to go back and hear that again, or study it, or think about it some. So if you have questions about anything that's said here, I don't always say this. In fact, I don't usually, but if you have some feedback or some comments, I'd be glad to hear from you. Certainly love to hear whatever it is on your heart. And again, thank you for studying from the Word of God. In Luke 5:33 through the end of the chapter, my Bible heading says this: Jesus is questioned about fasting. When we get into chapter 6, and we will, I'm not sure if we'll cover the first two sections or not. We're looking at Jesus as Lord of the Sabbath. Actually, two sections within that in Luke 6, 1 through 11. And then possibly at this study, we'll get into the choosing of the 12 apostles. That's in Luke's account, chapter 6, 12 through 16. On the study notes, I'll put parallels in usually Matthew and Mark. It's not common that John, at least in these early chapters, is going to have some meshing there, but I put these up there for you to consider, and occasionally I'll give reference to how a different gospel will add something or render a word a little differently. So I hope that's in there certainly to enhance and to enrich your study. So let's launch into that. Jesus' question about fasting. What I think is interesting is it follows on the heels of feasting. Jesus is at the home of Levi, or Matthew, the tax collector. He gave a great feast as he's about to leave his occupation, his friends, and go follow Jesus. And so they go from feasting to a question about fasting. And to me, those are two extremes, they're two opposites. Then they said to him, "Why do the disciples of John fast often and make prayers, and likewise those of the Pharisees, but yours eat and drink?" I want to stop right there and look at the question before I see the answer with you of what Jesus says. It's a good question. You know, sometimes questions are asked to try to trap us or maybe discredit us, and so you have to be careful about questions. Why do the disciples of John, that's John the Baptist, they fast often, it says, doesn't say how often, and they make prayers. They're not the only ones. It's the Pharisees, the disciples of the Pharisees, they fast and they pray. But now your disciples, we see them eating and drinking. I think the question is kind of designed, maybe your disciples really aren't on par with these others. Maybe it is asked to insinuate, Jesus, if your followers aren't as good as these others, maybe you're not the master that these others are. And so I'll first address it this way. We have no record of John teaching his disciples to fast or to pray. I say the last one, later the apostles will come to Jesus and say, "Lord, teach us to pray," as John also taught his disciples. So John did do that. It's just that we don't have an account back in the ministry of John doing that. And so was it fitting and right for John to teach and probably to model for his disciples fasting and prayer? Well, obviously prayer is good for any people in any generation, every dispensation, patriarchal, the Mosaic, Christian age. You've got prayer as a fundamental there. Fasting, there are references in the Old Testament. In fact, in the law of Moses, there's the only obligatory fast. It was on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. Leviticus 16 requires that, and so and gives the parameters for it. Now, by the time of Jesus, the Didache says that the Pharisees especially would fast on Mondays and Thursdays. I'm not sure if that was a total abstinence from food, or at least a partial fast, but Mondays and Thursdays, not because of anything in the law, but just a tradition. And so as the question is asked about fasting, I would look at it this way. As we think about the two groups and how they're singled out as doing it, nothing wrong with either one doing it, by the way. I think the criticism, and it's kind of a critical question. I don't think it's fair, certainly. Your disciples eat and drink. Well, you know what? John's disciples, although they did fast and pray, they ate and drank too. Else they would have they'd starved to death. And so, how do you make the distinctions? Sometimes, and I guess the spirit of legalism has always been there. People sometimes want to major in, let me show you where the line is. Let me spell it out for you, not because I can tie it to scripture, but just common practice or traditions where this ought to be. Here's the response of Jesus about fasting and prayer and why his disciples specifically weren't doing that, at least at this time. He says, can you make the friends of the bridegroom fast while the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and in those days they will fast. You know, as you compare John's gospel, for example, it talks about Jesus being like the bridegroom, and John says he doesn't use this terminology, maybe some of the modern translations. He's like the best man. He's the friend of the bridegroom. But now he's pointing people to the real deal. And so Jesus, maybe borrowing from that terminology, says, when you have a wedding, and ours are pretty short affairs compared to ones back then, some of those would extend at least a week, maybe over a period of a couple of weeks, but there would be all these traditional things they would do, certain responsibilities for the best man in this case. And so it's a festive atmosphere. No one is thinking about gloom and doom and staying away from indulgence. It's kind of the time to enjoy within moderation. I don't understand where that line is either. Enjoyment. And so Jesus is saying, by virtue of who I am, I'm different than the Pharisees. I'm different than John. And the disciples being with me now, if we equate fasting with kind of humbling ourselves, he's saying, being with me is a time of joy, but there will come a time when I'll be gone from them. The ones hearing him probably could not have envisioned that would be just about 3 years from then. Jesus still just 30 or 31, and so he's a young man. No one is thinking about how soon he might be taken away, but he knew when that was going to be. And so, what did Jesus know about fasting? Well, prior to this, in fact, not long before this, Jesus had fasted for 40 days. I bet they didn't know that. If the question or insinuation is, Jesus, you don't care about fasting, I wonder if he could have said to them, I've done it 40 days. Show of hands for all of you who've done that. How long would it take for someone to raise a hand? When Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount, moreover, when you fast, this is Matthew chapter 6, don't be like the hypocrites. There's a play on word in the Greek language. If we were to try to make sense of it in the English, it would be something like this. They disfigure their faces so that they may figure with people. They look all sad. They're wanting to draw attention to themselves. In other words, that fasting, which is designed to afflict the soul, to voluntarily say no to my bodily needs so that I can devote that time, especially spiritually. It's not just about stopping eating. We fast sometimes for medical tests or surgeries upcoming or things like that. Sometimes we fast just because we're mourning. We don't want food. It's not natural for us to eat then. But Jesus is talking about fasting in the specific sense, not of I'm starving to death. It's a time of war. There are no rations around, or someone has stolen all of our food. We're in a poverty situation. No, it's a purposeful devotion to God. So Jesus knew something about it. And as I go back to Matthew 6, the very same ones probably asking this question were under the censure of Jesus when he says, they're doing this for show. And so if Jesus were to teach on fasting as he did, one of the things he said is, don't make it about you. It's about God. And so whether or not this question was asked out of sincerity or not, Jesus kind of gives them some food for thought, doesn't he? He says it's not appropriate for this time. And then he's going to speak a parable to them. To me, this is one of the, I would call it for a lot of people, maybe the hardest one to interpret, to get a handle on. I'm going to do my best from my study up to this point to tell you what I think he's saying. Maybe some other layers or dimensions to it, but it's the adage about the old wine and the wineskins, the old garment, new garment. Let's just hear Jesus in Luke 5, verse 36. Then he spoke a parable to them. No one puts a piece from a new garment on an old one, Otherwise, the new garment makes a tear, and also the piece that was taken out of the new does not match the old. Now, I'm thinking about patches and about some of the methods that some of our mothers, maybe grandmothers, different generations used, and you might have patched, might have been even stylish, a fad to have unmatched or kind of colorful things like that. We don't know exactly the tendency back then, but I think he's referring to new garments that had not shrunk. If you put it on something that's already shrunk, it's not going to fit necessarily. It would tend to come loose. And so he's showing things that don't fit, things that don't match. I believe that Jesus is not leading the discussion. He's using illustrations to help people along. The idea again of fasting during a wedding feast, not appropriate. It's kind of not the right time. There's an incompatibility, if you will. And so he uses these different pieces of cloth. And look at the second illustration, verse 37. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, or else the new wine will burst the wineskins and be spilled, and the wineskins will be ruined. But new wine must be put into new wineskins, and both are preserved. I'll stop right there and then come to the next verse, the last one, in just a second. Their skins back then, the wine skins, probably from a goat. They would kill this animal. This maybe not for the squeamish, but they would take the esophagus and the stomach pouch and clean that, obviously. At least I hope they did. But they would put the wine in it. The wine, in its fermentation process, would swell. It just so happened that the intestines or the stomach of animals, I guess about any, would swell, because when we eat, they do, and they retract. And so they would put the wine in that, and it would swell. And it's kind of a single use only. So if you take, let's say the one is swollen through the fermentation process, and you empty the wine out, you drink it or whatever, you put more in. If it ferments again, it's going to swell that thing to a state in which it can handle it. And so he's talking about something not just hypothetically, but most of them from experience would relate to. It's going to split, it's going to burst, and so it's useless. There's not a compatibility. It doesn't fit together. And I think that Jesus is saying, using these two illustrations of the garments and the wineskins, that would be about as inappropriate as my disciples fasting while I am with them. The day will come in which they will fast. And so I'll come back to the question for us today: is fasting an obligation? I will say it's definitely an option. I can't find a scripture in the New Testament where Jesus says, if you want to be a faithful disciple of mine, you should fast. There were times when Paul fasted. In fact, he says in 2 Corinthians, in fastings often. Some of those may have been out of sadness. They could have been times when he is shipwrecked, or he's on a missionary journey and away from a food source, but maybe it's that he voluntarily abstained from food so that he might devote himself closer to God. For just about any of us, we could grow. It could be a wonderful opportunity of insight into a closer reunion with God. It's just, if I were to take the step and say, well, since it's a good thing, everybody has to do it. In fact, let me dictate to you when your day is. If I were to do that, in most cases, people would do it, but certainly from a duty motivation, not out of a desire one. So study more on your own this interesting topic of fasting. Jesus gives an answer here in which he at least defends his disciples. As we segue into chapter 6 of Luke, here's the section, Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. Now it happened on the second Sabbath. Some of the versions, by the way, just say on a Sabbath. There's a little discrepancy on some of the older manuscripts about what exactly is meant, but we know it's on a Sabbath. That he went through the grain fields, and his disciples plucked the heads of grain and ate them, rubbing them in their hands. And some of the Pharisees said to them, why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath? First note, in the King James Version, I think it may have the word corn there. Maybe some older translations as well. It's not corn in the sense of us thinking of sweet corn, yellow corn. It's grain, probably either barley or wheat. And so, thinking about how funny it is almost to imagine the Pharisees snooping. They're waiting in the shadows. They're spying out, trying to find some fault there. It's almost like they're following Jesus, but not from the motivation of respect and truly wanting to learn. It's what kind of little thing can we dredge up and use against him? Now, in Deuteronomy 23, verse 25, I've got the question, and there are parallels in Matthew 12 and Mark 2. Did the disciples of Jesus really break the law? Some have said this is kind of akin to stealing a watermelon. I'm sure none of you have ever done that or known someone who has, but imagine, certainly in more of an agricultural society, how tempting it would be. Maybe for us, it's that neighbor next door has the best tomato plants out there, and you know he's at work all day, and his wife is, and you get to looking at that tomato, and you think he's not going to miss just that one. I think I'll go help myself. In fact, that one's probably going to fall off and get trampled anyway. So uh, maybe we've helped ourselves. The disciples are walking through a grain field. If you'll read Deuteronomy 23, verse 25, it actually says, makes an allowance there. Now, that verse is not about, and these apostles are not about harvesting all of the grain. It's not about taking over possession of the field. It's that they're hungry, and there's kind of that allowance made. You know what? If you're in a desperate situation, help yourself. There's actually a provision. You leave some of it for the poor. And these apostles, who are at least as they're journeying with Jesus, they're kind of transient. It's not wrong for them to do it. It happened to be on the day of the week. That was the sticking point. It was the Sabbath there. And you know, I think it's the Mishnah had fairly recently, compared to the giving of the Old Testament law, they come up with a list of about 39 different things. They wanted to define what work was out of respect for one of the Ten Commandments, honoring the Sabbath day. Remember it to keep it holy. They made a list, and there was even this traditional thing of a Sabbath day's journey. Here's how far you can travel. One step more, and you violated it. You are a lawbreaker, jeopardizing your soul. One step short of it, you're fine. And so some of that was really silly. I think their intention was good. They wanted to respect the law, but just the application of it, I think they missed the point there some. Well, it happened to be that one of their stipulations was threshing, harvesting, something like that. You don't do that on the Sabbath. And so it's almost that they're saying, you know what, if you're taking a head of grain and rubbing it and eating just a mouthful, that is as if you've spent 8 or 10 hours out in the field threshing that and harvesting. You're both lawbreakers in doing it. And Jesus says, not so fast. Wait just a minute here. How's Jesus going to answer that? Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath? I would say, in answer to the question, did the disciples break the law? No, they did not. They didn't break it because of truly work on the Sabbath, because any of us, if we eat something, it's going to be some preparation. And so, unless you just literally are motionless for nearly 24 hours, could anybody be accused? And I'm thinking back in the first century of working somehow. Here's what Jesus says. Have you not even read this, what David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he went into the house of God, took and ate the showbread, and also gave some to those with him, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. All right, let me stop there for a second. What was the emphasis of Jesus on David here back in 1 Samuel 21? If you read that story, you realize that David is on the run from King Saul, and he actually tells a lie to the priest about his mission, and so that's an issue there. But clearly in the Old Testament law, the showbread was for the priest only. They would bake new and replace the old there. And so when the law said that they were to eat of it, it didn't have to say that no one else could. That was implied there. And so David comes, a couple of ways to look at this story. Some would believe in and teach a version of situation ethics. Situation ethics is not, in my opinion, and what I've done to study it, a viable way of looking at the law. It's not a God-honoring system at all. It's kind of one of those that says you don't really determine right or wrong unless you're in the situation. And so if this teaches situation ethics, it's against the law, but David's hungry and the men are hungry. And so, it's kind of the mercy triumphing over judgment. And in the end, it kind of gets away from, well, don't even worry about what the law says. In any given situation, you do what you feel is right, and God will be happy with that. It's not exactly what Jesus is saying here at all. Here's what I think is his point. David, in the Old Testament, although he's a man after God's own heart, did sin on this instance and other instances as well. Bathsheba, the numbering of the people, several things. And so David sinned, and yet none of the Jews would condemn him for that. And what I think Jesus is saying is, my disciples have not sinned. They're doing something that is lawful, and you're condemning them. And so he's showing again an inconsistency. How can you do that? It's almost like he's saying, well, if you're going to criticize them for that, then why would you even put David on a pedestal? He's a lawbreaker. And so it's almost like he's saying, apply the same consistency and understand that what you're doing is kind of a concocted criticism of these my followers here. And then he says to them, Luke's account, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. What does that mean? I think that Jesus is saying, I am the Lord, and I am the legislator of what truly is right. He's claiming an authority there that they didn't see at that time. Many of them never would see. In other words, he's saying, I'm the interpreter. If I say that it's okay, it's okay. And basically, he's saying the Mishnah, not so much what I'm telling you, and even the idea of a consideration for these disciples. It's almost like he's saying, what, if you know they're hungry, and instead of criticizing them for doing it, why don't you give them something to eat? Would that be a better alternative there? And so I think that the point they're making certainly is not a good one at all. There's an interesting thing. I think it's Matthew's account has Jesus saying, if any of you has a sheep that falls into a pit on the Sabbath, do you get it out? You think they kind of quietly looked at each other and thought, if they hadn't literally done it, I know what I would do. Well, yeah. Would that be working on the Sabbath? Yes. Do you think that God and everyone else would be okay with that? Probably. So then why are you criticizing these men for not, again, a banquet, but just a mouthful of food, just enough to temporarily help their hunger out? And so as you look at the answers of Jesus, be impressed with his wisdom. Be impressed with the idea that he knew how to say things, to put them in their place, and to show their relative heartlessness in most cases here. And then he's going to heal on the Sabbath. We need to read this in Luke 6, starting in verse 6. This will be the last thing we get to in this session of our study. Now it happened on another Sabbath that he also entered the synagogue and taught. And a man was there. Let me flip this page. Man was there whose right hand was withered. Interesting that it even designates the right instead of the left. So the scribes and Pharisees watched him closely, whether he would heal on the Sabbath, that they might find an accusation against him. Now think about that. They're watching Jesus, never far away. They're watching not, again, from the sense or the place of wanting to respect him and learn from him. They're finding an accusation. If you saw someone who was able to heal a person with a withered hand, and it's not trickery, not sleight of hand, anything like that, literally, what would that say about the authority of that person, the power? And yet all they can think about is the day of the week it's going to happen on. I put on the notes there, the Pharisees were so focused on the day that they missed the way, Jesus being the way and the truth and the life. And another fair question to me is, if this had been any other day of the week, let's say it's a Sunday through Friday, not on the Sabbath or Saturday, do you think they still would have tried to find some fault with him? Probably. It's one of those where he couldn't catch a break. He couldn't do anything to please them. They weren't going to see the truth or the reality right before their faces. Well, Jesus knew their thoughts, verse 8 says, and he said to the man who had the withered hand, arise and stand here. And he arose and stood, and then Jesus said to them, I will ask you one thing. You got a test. There's one question on it. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy? Which do you think God would approve of? This man being better, being restored, or not? And it says, when he looked around at them all, as in Mark's account, it says, with anger. With anger. He is so mad at the hardness of their hearts. He said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he did so, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. How long do you think that took? Was it a matter of minutes or hours? Did they stay there for days to see that slowly, imperceptibly change? No, it's instantaneous. Imagine there's a moment there in which everyone has to say, is he really the Son of God or not? I don't care what day it is. And so it's doing good. Can you do that? Jesus later in his ongoing controversy over the Sabbath and what was lawful versus what wasn't, he said, the law prescribed circumcision on the eighth day. On the eighth day. You think about 1/7 of the Hebrew males were born on a Friday, probably about that percentage, which meant that you circumcise them on what day? The Sabbath, a week after their first Sabbath. And so you're doing work on the Sabbath, aren't you? Yes. Is it okay? Yes. Why? Because that's not a command that's in conflict with another. It's okay to do that work. And Jesus actually says that the priests work on the Sabbath. Why? Because God told them to. Anybody have a problem or find fault with it? No. And so Jesus says, you need to quit splitting hairs. That's not his actual words. That's the way we would say it. You're making strange distinctions, just human contrived laws, and God is far from those things. Says they were filled with rage, and they discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. Parallel account says they wanted to destroy him. To destroy him. What is your fault? You have healed someone with a withered hand. What if that had been me or my family? I think I'd want to find out more about Jesus. I'd want to be open. Don't think I'd be focused on, well, is it Sabbath or not? If he'd have waited till just 1 minute after, sundown or something, could we have technically? We can get bogged down in some of those things, the minutia of interpretations. I pray that we don't. I pray that truly we want truth and common sense even to prevail. I've enjoyed studying this section with you. I hope something was said to help you want to study further and dig even deeper in the Word of God. So this coming Sunday night, Lord willing, about 5 o'clock, we'll look at the 12 apostles, Jesus choosing them, and some of the aftermath there in Luke chapter 6. God bless you. Have a good rest of your day.